Greetings, welcome to micro lecture 10.2. You probably watched the previous one, which was about the new Jim Crow. Now we're going to push this bubble a little bit further. We're going to talk about the impact of conviction and probation in a political sense, because the political sense feeds into much of the criminal justice system here. And I think, again, we have to broaden our approach to our introduction to criminal justice beyond the simple mechanics. So, a few statistics here. Today, more than 6 million Americans cannot vote because they have a felony conviction. Now, many states ban anyone ever convicted of a felony from voting even after release. Now, I'm going to talk about North Carolina a little bit, but release is an interesting term there too, because remember, we talked about community corrections here. So not only are we talking about people that are in prison and in jail, but we're talking about probation, which we're going to see some statistics in a little bit, is the most common result of a conviction. So this disenfranchisement of Americans, this stripping away of the right of Americans to vote, has been accelerating. In 1976, it was approximately 1.17 million. By 96, 20 years later, it was 3.3 million. By 2010, it was 5.8 million, and today it's 6.6. So as you can see, this number has been going steadily up. Okay, there are a few states that have dramatically higher rates. So in Alabama, Florida, Kentucky, Mississippi, Tennessee, and Virginia, 7% or more of their population are banned from voting. If we look at just blacks in those populations, in 4 of the most critical states here, it becomes even worse. So in Florida, 21% of African Americans or blacks cannot vote in the state because they have a felony conviction, or they're on probation or parole, or they're in prison or jail. In Kentucky, it's 26, in Tennessee, it's 21, and in Virginia, it's 22. And this points out one of the things that's of interest to us here. At what point should rights be restored? Now, North Carolina has a bit of a different approach. North Carolina has many of the same problems, so we look at the problems here, but I want to focus on North Carolina in 1 second. North Carolina restricts those who are in prison, on parole, or probation from voting. But, and this is a big but, and this is why we're not in the top 7. Once you have served your prison term, or your parole ends, or your probation ends, you have most of your rights restored in North Carolina. Now, it still means, though, we do incarcerate by ethnic groups at different rates. So that first chart there, you'll notice that if we look at a breakdown per 100 in the population, 100,000, it's approximately 357 whites, but it's 1,664 African Americans, 491 Hispanics, or Native Americans have very high rates in North Carolina as well, of 883. The other chart over there is to give you a little bit of perspective. 65% of North Carolina is white by classification. 22% is black. But then if you look at our prison and jail populations, you'll notice that even though they are 22% of the population, they are 55% of the prisons. Whites are 65, but they're only 36. So roughly, if you wanted to play with numbers and generate something of interest, if you're white or if you're black, a white person compared to a black person, not in raw numbers, but compared, is about a 5th as likely to wind up in prison. Okay, the total number in North Carolina, here's the numbers for you. There are, and this is the most recent data I could find for you, there's approximately 160,000 people who have been captured by the system. You'll notice that 36,000 are in your state prisons, 19,000 are in jails, the vast bulk of whom have not been convicted of a crime. 12,000 are on parole, 11,000 are in federal prisons, we forget about them, but 81,000, more than half, are on probation. And in North Carolina, if you're on probation, you have very limited rights. You don't have a right to, for example, own a firearm, so your Second Amendment rights are gone. You don't have the right to vote. So you're very restricted. Now, North Carolina does not restrict the vote after probation parole. Unlike those other states, and that's why we're not as high, we don't do it as to the severe level. This other chart I wanted to show for you, and this chart was actually before some justice reform in 2011, but I wanted to show you something of interest here, which again is something we don't think about when we're thinking about community corrections. These are probation and revocation rates. So if you look at these, you'll notice that the largest cities in North Carolina are Raleigh and Charlotte, followed by Winston-Salem, Greenville, Wilmington, Asheville. You'll notice that in none of those counties is the revocation rate much over 30 or 40%. But it's the rural counties, if you look at them here and up here, and this is what's sometimes called the Black Belt in North Carolina up here because it's a heavy black population, the revocation rate goes up over 50%. In these major urban, like New Hanover down here, it's under, I think it's about 26. Charlotte's about 22. Raleigh's a little bit higher, but it's still, I believe, in the 20s. Winston-Salem is in the 30s. Asheville, again, I think it might be the lowest, if I'm not mistaken, is in the 20s again. So you'll notice that the cities then are going to have lower revocation rates, which means there's going to be more people available, have the right to vote in those cities. The end result of which is you're going to create a split in the state between those cities that have high numbers of voters and those rural areas that have lower number of voters but are more homogeneous. So the 2011 Justice Reinvestment Act really sought with limited success to limit this incarceration. But rural areas continue to show much higher rates of incarcerations of blacks and Hispanics. And of course, this restricts the vote in a geographical way, making the city vote more diverse and the rural vote much more white. And if you look at our politics in North Carolina, that's being played out. And I think it's an important thing to keep in mind when we look at some of the issues attached to the political impact of probation and parole.